Sometimes the best things in life come in the smallest packages. And sometimes, when you've got nothing left but faith and 50 cents, that's exactly enough to change everything. In 1889, in the dusty heart of the New Mexico Territory, a broke cowboy named Silas Boone made a choice that would transform his life forever. He bought a tiny horse at auction, a creature so small that grown men laughed and called him a fool for wasting his last coin. But that little pony named Penny had something special. She had a gift that would take them from the poorest corners of the frontier to the brightest stages across the West. How does a man with nothing and a horse no bigger than a dog become the most talked about act in America? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun was already high and hot when Silas Boone finished mucking out the stalls behind Garrett's general store. He straightened slowly, one hand pressed against the small of his back, where the old injury still made itself known on certain days. Today was one of those days. The kind of day that reminded him he wasn't the young ranch hand he'd once been. The kind that made him feel every one of his 40 years. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with a bandana that had seen better days and surveyed his morning's work. 3 stalls cleaned, fresh hay laid down, water troughs scrubbed and filled. It was honest work, the kind that left a man tired but not ashamed. Mr. Garrett would pay him 50 cents for the job, maybe throw in a can of beans if business had been good. That 50 cents would keep Silas fed for another few days if he was careful. Santa Rosa wasn't much of a town, even by New Mexico Territory standards. A handful of buildings clustered along a dusty main street. A saloon, a general store, a small church, and maybe 30 permanent residents if you counted generously. It sat in the middle of nowhere, a place people passed through on their way to somewhere better. Silas had been passing through 3 years ago when his money ran out and his options ran dry. He'd been here ever since. He collected his pay from Mr. Garrett, who counted out the coins with the careful attention of a man who knew the value of every penny. Silas thanked him and stepped back out into the afternoon heat. His next job wasn't until tomorrow, fence mending for the widow Yates, which meant he had the rest of the day to himself. In better times, that might have been a luxury. These days, it just meant more hours to fill and nothing to fill them with. His boarding room was at Mrs. Carmichael's place, a narrow house at the end of the street that leaned slightly to one side, as if tired of standing upright. Mrs. Carmichael was a widow herself, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and a practical kindness that never quite crossed into charity. She charged Silas $2 a week for a room barely big enough for a bed and a washstand, and she expected payment on time. He was 3 weeks behind. The room was stifling in the afternoon heat, so Silas took his worn leather saddle, the one valuable thing he still owned from his previous life, and sat outside on the narrow porch. The saddle was good quality, made by a craftsman in Amarillo, back when Silas had steady work and a future that looked like something. He'd been a ranch hand then, a good one. The kind of rider who could gentle a wild horse or rope a steer with the best of them. That was before the accident. A spooked mare, a hard fall, and a leg that never quite healed right. The ranch foreman had been sympathetic but firm. A cowboy who couldn't ride wasn't much use on a cattle ranch. They'd paid him for the month and wished him well. That had been 4 years ago. Silas ran his hand over the saddle's smooth leather, checking for cracks, rubbing neat's foot oil into the dry spots. It was a ritual he performed every few weeks, keeping the saddle in good condition, even though he had no horse to put it on. Sometimes he thought about selling it. A saddle like this would fetch maybe $10, enough to pay Mrs. Carmichael what he owed and buy himself a week or 2 of breathing room. But he could never quite bring himself to do it. The saddle was a connection to the man he'd been, a reminder that he'd once been worth something. Mr. Boone. Mrs. Carmichael's voice came from the doorway behind him. She didn't sound angry, just tired. I need to speak with you about the rent. Silas set down the oil rag and turned to face her. Yes, ma'am. I know I'm behind. I've got work lined up for tomorrow, and there's talk of some hauling jobs next week. I'll have your money soon." She studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "You're a good man, Silas, hard-working and honest. But I've got my own bills to pay. I can give you until the end of the month, but after that I'll need to rent the room to someone who can pay." "I understand. Thank you for your patience, ma'am." She nodded and went back inside, leaving Silas alone with his saddle and his thoughts. The end of the month was 8 days away. He'd need at least 3 more jobs just to cover what he owed, and that was if he didn't eat much. The mathematics of poverty were simple and unforgiving. That evening, Silas walked down to Dutch Henry's saloon, not to drink, he couldn't afford that, but because the company was free. Dutch Henry was a big man with a bigger voice, a former prospector who'd found more gold selling whiskey to miners than he'd ever found in the ground. His saloon was the social heart of Santa Rosa, such as it was. "Silas," Dutch Henry greeted him with a nod. "You look like a man carrying the weight of the world." "Just the weight of Santa Rosa," Silas replied, managing a tired smile. "That's heavy enough." Dutch Henry chuckled and slid a glass of water across the bar. "On the house. You hear about the livestock auction tomorrow?" Silas shook his head. "What auction?" "A fellow from Las Vegas is bringing some stock through." "Horses mostly?" "Some mules. They're setting up in the old corral by the church. Figured a man with your eye for horses might want to have a look. Appreciate the thought. But looking is about all I can afford these days." "Never know what you might find," Dutch Henry said with a shrug. "Sometimes opportunities come cheap." The conversation moved on to other topics: weather, politics, the railroad that might someday reach Santa Rosa if the town lasted that long. Silas listened more than he talked, grateful for the distraction. When the evening grew late, he thanked Dutch Henry and walked back to Mrs. Carmichael's under a sky full of stars. Sleep didn't come easy that night. His mind kept turning over the same problems, looking for solutions that weren't there. The rent, the jobs that might or might not materialize, the gnawing fear that he was running out of options and out of time. Somewhere past midnight, he finally drifted off, dreaming of better days and horses he used to ride. Morning came with the harsh light of another cloudless day. Silas washed his face in the basin, put on his cleanest shirt, which wasn't saying much, and walked to the church to see about this auction. He told himself he was just curious, just passing time. But deep down he knew better. He was hoping for something, anything, that might change his luck. The corral was already filling with people when he arrived. Ranchers and farmers mostly. Men with money in their pockets and purpose in their eyes. Silas recognized Burton Graves right away, a wealthy cattleman who owned most of the land around Santa Rosa. Graves stood with his 2 sons, all 3 of them dressed in clothes that cost more than Silas made in a year. They were the kind of men who never had to worry about rent or where their next meal was coming from. The auctioneer was setting up his stand, and horses were being led into viewing pens. Silas found a spot along the fence where he could watch without getting in anyone's way. The horses were good quality, he could see that right away. Strong backs, good legs, the kind of animals that would serve a working ranch well. One by one, they were led to the auction block and sold for prices that made Silas's head spin. $20, $40. One particularly fine gelding went for $65. Silas reached into his pocket and felt the coins there. 2 quarters, a dime, a nickel, 5 pennies, 75 cents total, and he needed at least 50 of that for food. He was about to leave when he heard the laughter. What in the name of... Burton Graves's voice carried across the corral. "Is that supposed to be a horse?" Silas looked toward the auction block and saw what Graves was laughing at. Being led into the ring by a nervous-looking handler was the smallest horse he'd ever seen. Not a pony exactly. Something else. The creature couldn't have stood more than 30 inches at the shoulder, with a delicate frame and legs like twigs. Her coat was a dusty brown, matted and dull from poor care. She looked half-starved and completely out of place among the working stock. The laughter spread through the crowd. Even the auctioneer seemed embarrassed to be presenting such an animal. "Folks, this here is, well, she's small, I'll grant you that." The auctioneer tried to maintain his professional demeanor. "But she's gentle and sound." Might make a pet for children, I suppose. Might make a snack for my dogs, someone called out, and the crowd roared with laughter. Silas watched the little horse flinch at the noise. Her ears went back, and she tried to make herself smaller, pressing against the handler's leg. Something about that gesture, that attempt to find safety in a hostile world, struck Silas deep in his chest. He knew exactly how that felt. "Let's start the bidding at $5, the auctioneer said, without much hope. Silence. Nobody moved. "All right. $2 then. Anyone? $2 for the little lady here?" More silence. Burton Graves lit a cigar and made a show of turning his back on the proceedings. $1. Surely someone... 50 cents. Silas heard his own voice before he'd consciously decided to speak. Every head in the corral turned to look at him. The auctioneer blinked in surprise. "Did you say 50 cents, sir?" "Yes, sir." "That's what I said." The laughter started again, but this time Silas was part of the joke. Burton Graves turned back around, grinning broadly. Well, looks like Boone here is finally getting himself a thoroughbred. That's about all a man like him can afford, I suppose." Silas felt his face flush hot, but he kept his eyes on the little horse. She was looking at him now, her large dark eyes meeting his. There was intelligence there and something else. A kind of quiet dignity despite her circumstances. 50 cents, the auctioneer repeated. "Anyone else? No? Well then," he brought down his gavel. "Sold to Mr. Boone for 50 cents. Silas walked to the auction stand on legs that felt unsteady. He counted out the coins, 2 quarters that represented his last bit of security in the world, and handed them over. The handler gave him a rope lead attached to the little horse's halter and stepped back quickly, as if glad to be rid of the burden. "Good luck with your purchase, Boone," Burton Graves called out, still laughing. Maybe she can pull a child's wagon for you." That's about all she's good for. His sons joined in the laughter, and soon the whole crowd was chuckling and pointing. Silas ignored them all. He bent down, not far given the horse's size, and gently touched her neck. She didn't pull away. "Come on then," he said softly. "Let's get you somewhere quiet." The walk back through Santa Rosa felt like the longest journey of Silas's life. Every person they passed stopped to stare. Some pointed. Some laughed outright. Word traveled fast in a small town, and by the time Silas reached Mrs. Carmichael's place, it seemed like everyone in Santa Rosa had heard about his purchase. Mrs. Carmichael came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at Silas, then at the tiny horse, then back at Silas. Her expression was difficult to read. "Mr. Boone," she said carefully, "did you spend money on that animal?" "Yes, ma'am." 50 cents. 50 cents that I assume you needed for food." "Yes, ma'am." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, her expression softened. "There's a small stable out back. It's not much, but it's dry. You can keep her there if you promise to clean up after her." "Thank you, Mrs. Carmichael, I promise." He led the little horse around to the back of the house, where a lean-to structure served as a makeshift stable. It was barely big enough for a regular horse, which meant it was almost spacious for this tiny creature. There was some old hay in the corner and a bucket Silas could fill with water. He tied the lead rope loosely to a post and stepped back to really look at his purchase in the fading light. The little horse looked back at him with those intelligent eyes, and for the first time all day, Silas felt something other than regret. He felt curious. What had he just done? He'd spent his last 50 cents on an animal he didn't need and couldn't afford to feed. He'd made himself the laughingstock of Santa Rosa. He'd chosen this tiny, fragile creature over his own immediate survival. And yet, as he watched her lower her head to sniff at the hay, moving with a surprising grace despite her poor condition, Silas couldn't quite bring himself to regret it. There was something about her, something he couldn't name, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't made a mistake after all. He found a rag and spent the last hour of daylight gently cleaning the dust and dirt from her coat. She stood patiently through it all, occasionally turning her head to watch him work. By the time he finished, her coat had regained some of its natural color, a warm chestnut brown that caught the last rays of the sun. "Need a name," Silas said aloud. Can't just keep calling you little horse. She turned her head at the sound of his voice, ears pricked forward with interest. How about Penny? Seems fitting since you cost me 50 of them. The horse, Penny, blinked her large eyes and then, inexplicably, lowered her head in what looked almost like a bow. Silas stared at her, momentarily speechless. That couldn't have been intentional, could it? He shook his head and finished up for the night, making sure she had water and what hay he could spare. Tomorrow, he'd have to figure out how to feed her properly, how to pay his rent, how to survive this latest in a long line of questionable decisions. But for tonight, standing in the gathering darkness with this strange little horse, Silas Boone allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt hope. The mockery didn't end with the auction. If anything, it grew worse over the following days. Everywhere Silas went in Santa Rosa, people had something to say about his purchase. Some comments were good-natured, the kind of ribbing that friends might share. Others carried a sharper edge, the sort of cruelty that comes easy to people who need someone to look down on. Burton Graves seemed to take particular pleasure in the situation. He made a point of riding past Mrs. Carmichael's place at least once a day, always slowing down when he reached the stable where Penny was kept. "How's that racing stock of yours, Boone?" he'd call out. "Thinking of entering her in the Kentucky Derby?" His sons would laugh right on cue, and Graves would ride on, satisfied with himself. Silas learned to ignore it. He'd dealt with worse than Burton Graves in his life, and he figured the man would get tired of the joke, eventually. What bothered Silas, more than the mockery, was the practical reality of his situation. He'd spent his last 50 cents on Penny, which meant he was now completely broke. The widow Yates paid him 75 cents for a full day of fence mending, but that money went straight to buying oats and hay for Penny. She was thin, undernourished, and needed proper feeding if she was going to survive, which meant Silas went hungry. Again, Mrs. Carmichael noticed, of course. She had eyes in her head and a working understanding of mathematics. She started leaving plates of food outside Silas's door, always with some excuse about having cooked too much or not wanting leftovers to go to waste. Silas knew charity when he saw it, but he was also hungry enough to accept it with gratitude. Father Miguel, the priest at the small Catholic church, stopped by one afternoon to check on him. The padre was a thin man in his 50s, with kind eyes and a practical approach to faith that Silas appreciated. "I heard about your purchase," Father Miguel said, leaning against the stable fence to watch Penny. She was investigating a pile of fresh hay with apparent satisfaction. "People are talking. People always talk," Silas replied. "Doesn't cost them anything." True enough. The priest was quiet for a moment. "Why did you buy her, Silas?" "You don't strike me as an impulsive man." Silas considered the question. He'd been asking himself the same thing. "I'm not entirely sure, Father. I looked at her standing there, scared and alone, and I couldn't walk away." "Does that make sense?" "More sense than you might think," Father Miguel smiled. "Sometimes the things we need find us in unexpected packages. Maybe you needed each other." After the priest left, Silas found himself thinking about those words. Maybe they had needed each other. God knows, he'd been feeling pretty scared and alone himself lately. He'd been spending more time with Penny, not just out of necessity, but because he genuinely enjoyed her company. There was something calming about her presence, something that eased the constant anxiety that had become his normal state. He'd sit on an overturned bucket and talk to her while he worked on his saddle or mended his clothes. She seemed to listen, her ears tracking the sound of his voice. That's when he started noticing the unusual things. Penny was smart. Not just horse smart, but genuinely remarkably intelligent. When Silas called her name, she'd come immediately, even though he'd only had her a few days. When he held out his hand with a piece of apple, she'd wait patiently until he gave permission before taking it. Little things, maybe, but they added up to something that felt significant. The real breakthrough came almost by accident. Silas had been brushing her coat, talking to her about his day, when he mentioned he was worried about money. Without thinking, he said, "I just don't know what to do, Penny." She'd looked at him directly, and then, clear as day, shook her head from side to side. No, Silas stopped brushing. Did you just understand what I said? Penny tilted her head, studying him with those intelligent eyes. If you understand me, Silas said slowly. Nod your head. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Penny lowered her head and raised it again in an unmistakable nod. Silas felt his heart start to race. Do that again, she did. A clear, deliberate nod. Holy, Silas sat down hard on his bucket. You can understand me. Over the next few days, he experimented cautiously, not quite believing what he was seeing. He'd ask Penny simple questions, yes or no questions, and she'd respond appropriately. Not every time and not perfectly, but often enough that it couldn't be coincidence. Then he discovered she could do more than communicate. She could perform. It happened one evening when Silas was particularly discouraged. He'd been turned down for a hauling job, which meant he still had no money for rent. He was sitting on his bucket, head in his hands, when Penny walked up and gently nudged his shoulder. When he looked up, she took several steps backward, then rose up slightly on her hind legs and lowered her front end in an elegant bow. Silas blinked in astonishment. Where did you learn that? She did it again, this time adding a little flourish with her front hoof. Can you do anything else? Over the next hour, Silas discovered that Penny had an entire repertoire of tricks. She could bow, she could shake her head yes and no, she could lift her hooves one at a time on command. Most remarkably, when he told her to play dead, she carefully lowered herself to the ground, rolled onto her side, and lay completely still until he told her to get up. Someone had trained her. Trained her well. This wasn't the behavior of a neglected animal sold for 50 cents at a livestock auction. This was a performing horse, skilled and practiced. The realization left Silas with more questions than answers. Who had owned Penny before? Why had she ended up at that auction? How had someone trained her to do all this and then let her go? He didn't have answers, but he had something else. He had an idea. The next evening, after much internal debate, Silas walked into Dutch Henry's saloon with Penny on a lead rope. The place went silent the moment they entered. Every head turned, every conversation stopped. Dutch Henry looked up from behind the bar, eyebrows raised. Silas, you bringing your livestock to drink now? Not exactly. Silas felt his face flush but pushed forward. I was hoping I could show folks something. Something special about Penny here. This ought to be good, someone muttered from a corner table. Burton Graves was there, of course, sitting with his sons and a few ranch hands. He leaned back in his chair with an amused smile. By all means, Boone, show us what that 50-cent wonder horse can do. Pull a child's cart? Maybe she can carry your saddlebags? Laughter rippled through the room. Silas ignored it. He led Penny to a clear space in the center of the saloon and took a deep breath. Penny, he said quietly. Bow! She bowed, deep and graceful, her nose almost touching the floor. The laughter stopped. People leaned forward, suddenly interested. Now stand up and shake your head no. Penny stood and shook her head from side to side. Now nod yes. She nodded. Silas ran through several more simple tricks, and the room grew quieter with each one. When he finally asked Penny to play dead, and she carefully lowered herself to the floor with all the drama of a trained actress, someone actually applauded. I'll be damned, Dutch Henry said softly. That little horse is something special. Even Burton Graves had stopped smiling. He was watching Penny with narrowed eyes, the look of a man recalculating his assessment of a situation. She's smart, Silas said, finding his voice. Smartest horse I've ever seen, regardless of size. I thought folks might enjoy seeing what she can do. Do it again, someone called out. Do the playing dead part again. Silas did, and this time, when Penny collapsed dramatically to the floor, the whole saloon burst into applause and laughter. But not mocking laughter. This was the sound of genuine delight, of people seeing something remarkable and unexpected. Dutch Henry came around from behind the bar, studying Penny with professional interest. You know, Silas, people would pay to see this. I mean, actually pay money. You think so? I know so. Look around. Every man in here is smiling, and that's rare enough. You bring that little horse back here tomorrow night and put on a proper show. I'll split the take with you, 50-50. Silas felt something unfold in his chest. something that had been coiled tight for months. "You're serious?" "Dead serious. I'll spread the word, get a crowd in here. You just show up with your horse and do what you did tonight." Dutch Henry grinned. "I think you might have stumbled onto something good, my friend." That night, lying on his narrow bed in Mrs. Carmichael's boarding house, Silas stared at the ceiling and allowed himself to think about possibilities. Maybe Penny wasn't just a tiny horse he'd bought on impulse. Maybe she was something more. Maybe she was the answer to prayers he'd been too discouraged to properly pray. In the stable below, Penny stood in her stall, her intelligent eyes watching the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new crowds, new challenges, new opportunities. She'd been trained for this, prepared for this, and somehow she'd found her way to a man who needed her as much as she needed him. The little horse lowered her head and rested, gathering her strength for the performances to come. The morning after his arrangement with Dutch Henry, Silas woke with a knot of anxiety in his stomach. He'd committed to performing, which meant he needed to make sure Penny was in top form. More than that, he needed to figure out how to turn a handful of tricks into an actual show that people would pay to see. He spent the early hours working with Penny in the small stable yard, running through her repertoire of movements. She was responsive and eager, picking up on his cues almost before he finished giving them. The more time he spent with her, the more convinced he became that she'd been professionally trained. Her movements were too precise, too polished to be anything else. Mrs. Carmichael watched from the back porch for a while, her arms crossed, but her expression thoughtful rather than disapproving. When Silas took a break, she brought him a cup of coffee and a biscuit. "That horse of yours is quite something," she said. "I'll admit, I thought you'd lost your mind spending money on her. Now I'm not so sure." "Makes two of us," Silas replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "I still don't understand how she ended up at that auction. Maybe that's not the question you should be asking. Maybe the question is what you're going to do with her now that you have her." It was good advice. Silas had always been better at looking backward than forward, dwelling on mistakes rather than planning for opportunities. But here was an opportunity, real and tangible, and he needed to make the most of it. He fashioned a simple costume piece for Penny from an old red bandana he'd had for years. The cloth had gold thread running through it, faded but still visible. He tied it around her neck like a neckerchief, and the effect was surprisingly charming. She looked less like a neglected auction animal and more like a performer preparing for the stage. "That suits you," Silas told her, and she bobbed her head as if in agreement. Father Miguel stopped by again that afternoon, bringing with him a small bag of apples. "For your partner," he explained. "I heard about tonight's performance. The whole town has heard, actually. Dutch Henry has been spreading the word to everyone who'll listen." "That makes me nervous," Silas admitted. "What if she gets scared with a big crowd? What if I forget what to do? Then you'll figure it out as you go, same as everything else in life." The priest smiled. "You know what I think, Silas? I think you've been living so long with disappointment that you've forgotten how to recognize a blessing when it shows up." The words stayed with Silas as the afternoon wore on and evening approached. A blessing. Was that what Penny was? It seemed too simple, too easy. Blessings were things that happened to other people, to folks who went to church regular and lived righteous lives. Silas was just a broken-down cowboy who'd made more bad choices than good ones. But when he looked at Penny, at her bright eyes and eager attention, he couldn't quite dismiss the idea. Dutch Henry's saloon was packed when Silas arrived that evening. Word had spread beyond Santa Rosa, apparently, because there were faces in the crowd he didn't recognize. Miners from the camps to the north, farmers from the outlying homesteads, even a few well-dressed travelers who'd stopped in town and heard about the tiny performing horse. "Standing room only," Dutch Henry said with satisfaction. "Haven't seen a crowd like this in years. You ready?" Silas wasn't sure he'd ever be ready, but he nodded anyway. "As ready as I'm going to be." The saloon had a small raised area at one end that served as a makeshift stage. Dutch Henry helped Silas lead Penny up onto it, and the crowd grew quiet with anticipation. Silas looked out at all those faces, some friendly, some skeptical, some just curious, and felt his throat go dry. "Folks," he began, then stopped to clear his throat. Folks, thank you for coming tonight. What you're about to see is, well, it's something special. This here is Penny, and she's the smartest horse I've ever known, regardless of size. He ran through the routine he'd planned, starting with simple commands and building to more complex tricks. Penny performed beautifully, seeming to enjoy the attention. When she bowed, people applauded. When she nodded yes and shook her head no in response to Silas's questions, they laughed with delight. And when she finally played dead, collapsing to the stage with perfect dramatic timing, the applause was thunderous. Silas felt something shift inside him during that performance. The fear and anxiety fell away, replaced by a kind of joy he'd almost forgotten existed. He wasn't just showing off a trained animal. He was bringing happiness to people, giving them something to smile about in hard times. That meant something. When the show ended, people rushed forward to get a closer look at Penny. Children especially wanted to meet her, and she was gentle and patient with all of them, allowing them to pet her soft nose and exclaim over her tiny hooves. Dutch Henry was grinning from ear to ear when he finally shooed the last customers out and locked the door. "Silas, my friend, do you know how much we took in tonight?" "No idea. $8.40. That's $4.20 each." He counted out the coins into Silas's hand. "And that's just the first night. Word's going to spread even further. We could do this every week. Hell, maybe twice a week, $4.20. It was more money than Silas had held at one time in months. It was enough to pay Mrs. Carmichael what he owed, to buy proper food for himself and Penny, to maybe even start saving a little for the future. "I don't know what to say," Silas managed. "Don't say anything. Just bring that remarkable little horse back next Saturday." Dutch Henry clapped him on the shoulder. "You've got something special here. Don't let it slip away." Walking back to Mrs. Carmichael's that night, with Penny trotting contentedly beside him and money jingling in his pocket, Silas felt like a different man than the one who'd walked to that auction days ago. He'd taken a chance on something small and strange and seemingly worthless, and that chance was starting to pay off in ways he'd never imagined. Mrs. Carmichael was waiting on the porch when he arrived. Without a word, he counted out the money he owed her for back rent and placed it in her hand. She looked at the coins, then at him. "You did it." "Penny did it," Silas corrected. "I just stood there and told her what to do." "You did more than that. You saw potential where others saw a joke. That takes vision, Silas, and courage." She closed her hand around the money. "Your rent's paid through the end of the month. After that, we'll start fresh." In the stable, Silas gave Penny an extra portion of oats and spent a long time brushing her coat until it shone in the lamplight. She stood patiently through it all, occasionally turning her head to look at him with what he could only describe as contentment. "We're going to be all right," he told her. "I don't know how it happened or why, but we're going to be just fine." Penny lowered her head and nudged his hand, and Silas felt his throat tighten with emotion he couldn't quite name. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he believed the words he'd just spoken. They were going to be all right. Together, they were going to make something of this unexpected partnership. In his room later, lying in bed with the sound of Penny moving softly in the stable below, Silas allowed himself to dream. Not big dreams, not yet. Just small ones. Enough money to live on. Enough purpose to make life feel worthwhile. Enough hope to keep moving forward. It was enough. For now, it was more than enough. The performances at Dutch Henry's became a regular thing. Every Saturday night, and soon Wednesday nights too, Silas and Penny would take the stage to a packed house. The shows evolved over the weeks. Silas learned how to work a crowd, how to build suspense, how to time the tricks for maximum impact. Penny seemed to understand what was expected of her, and she delivered with a consistency that never ceased to amaze him. The money was good. Not rich man money, but steady and reliable. Silas was able to pay his rent on time, buy proper food, even start putting a little aside. But more than the money, it was the respect that changed things. People in Santa Rosa started looking at him differently. Not as the broke cowboy doing odd jobs, but as the man with the remarkable performing horse. Even Burton Graves stopped making jokes, though Silas noticed the rancher watching the performances with Calculating eyes. Word spread beyond Santa Rosa. Travelers passing through would hear about Penny and make a point to stop at Dutch Henry's. Some folks rode in from 20 miles away just to see the show. The saloon was doing better business than it had in years, and Dutch Henry was grateful enough to increase Silas's cut to 60% of the take. Father Miguel started attending the performances regularly, always sitting in the back and smiling throughout. One evening after a show, he pulled Silas aside. "You've found your calling," the priest said. "Not many people discover their purpose so clearly. That's a gift. I'm not sure standing in a saloon with a tiny horse qualifies as a calling, Father." "Why not? You're bringing joy to people. You're using the gifts you've been given. Your way with animals, your honest nature, your perseverance. That sounds like a calling to me." The words stuck with Silas. He'd never thought of himself as someone with gifts or purpose. He was just trying to survive. But maybe survival could become something more. Maybe it already had. He started working on new material for the shows. He taught Penny to count by pawing the ground with her hoof. He'd ask her simple arithmetic questions. "What's 2 plus 2, Penny?" And she'd paw the ground 4 times. The crowd loved it, even though Silas knew he was cueing her with subtle signals. It didn't matter. The illusion was what counted, and Penny sold it beautifully. He also created more elaborate costume pieces. Using scraps of fabric and his own rough sewing skills, he made a small blanket decorated with brass buttons for Penny to wear during the finale. The effect was surprisingly professional, lending an air of legitimacy to their act. Mrs. Carmichael helped with the sewing once she saw what Silas was attempting. She had a better hand for needlework and turned his crude attempts into something genuinely attractive. She seemed to enjoy the project, often sitting on the porch in the evenings, working on new costume elements while Silas practiced with Penny in the yard. "You know," she said one evening, "I never thought I'd see the day when I'd be making costumes for a horse." "Life takes strange turns." "That it does," Silas agreed. "Thank you for this, Mrs. Carmichael. You didn't have to help. Maybe I wanted to. Maybe it's nice to be part of something successful for a change." She looked at him over her sewing. "You've changed, Silas. You carry yourself different now. More confident?" He thought about that. Had he changed? He still felt like the same broke cowboy inside, but maybe she was right. He wasn't afraid all the time anymore. The constant anxiety about money and survival had eased. He could think about tomorrow without dread. That was new. Not everyone was happy about Silas's success. Burton Graves approached him one afternoon, as Silas was coming back from buying feed. The rancher blocked his path, his 2 sons flanking him like always. "Boone," Graves said, "I want to buy your horse." "She's not for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price. I'll give you $50. That's 100 times what you paid for her." Silas looked at Graves steadily. "I said she's not for sale. My daughters would love a pet like that. Small, does tricks. It's perfect. I'll go $75. That's more money than you'll make in months of saloon shows." "The answer is no, Mr. Graves. Penny's not a pet, and she's not for sale at any price." Graves's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake, Boone. That horse is a novelty. People will get tired of seeing the same tricks. You'll be back to scraping by within a year, mark my words. Sell now while you can get something for her." Silas moved past the rancher without responding. He knew what Graves was really upset about. It wasn't that he wanted Penny for his daughters. It was that Silas Boone, the man he'd mocked and looked down on, was succeeding. That bothered Burton Graves more than he wanted to admit. The incident left Silas unsettled. Not because he doubted his decision to keep Penny, that had never been in question, but because Graves had touched on a genuine fear. What if people did get tired of the act? What if this success was temporary? He'd built his whole life around Penny now. If the performances stopped drawing crowds, he'd be right back where he started. He mentioned his concerns to Dutch Henry that evening while setting up for the show. "People might get tired of the same act," Dutch Henry agreed. "That's why you don't give them the same act. You keep it fresh, keep adding new elements." "But I'll tell you something, Silas. I've been running this saloon for 15 years, and I've never seen anything draw crowds like that little horse of yours." "You've got something special. Don't let men like Burton Graves make you doubt it. The show that night was one of their best. The saloon was so packed that people were standing outside peering through the windows to catch glimpses of the performance. Silas introduced a new trick, teaching Penny to pick up a hat with her teeth and carry it around, collecting tips from the audience. The crowd loved it, and the hat came back heavy with coins. When it was over and the crowd had finally dispersed, Silas counted out their earnings. $14. It was more than they'd ever made in a single night. "We're building towards something," Dutch Henry said. "I can feel it. Something bigger than Saturday night shows in a frontier saloon." Silas didn't know what he meant, but the words felt prophetic somehow. He walked home that night with Penny beside him, the stars bright overhead and a sense of anticipation building in his chest. They'd come so far already. Where else might this path lead? In the stable, as he settled Penny for the night, she did something she'd never done before. She stepped close to him and rested her head against his chest, standing perfectly still. It was a gesture of trust, of affection, of partnership. Silas wrapped his arms gently around her small frame and felt his eyes sting with unexpected emotion. "We're in this together," he told her. "Whatever comes, we face it together." She made a soft sound, almost like agreement, and Silas knew with absolute certainty that everything had changed. They weren't just man and horse anymore, weren't just performer and trained animal. They were partners. They were family. And whatever lay ahead, that bond would see them through. The answer to what lay ahead arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the form of 3 brightly painted wagons rolling into Santa Rosa. Silas was working in the stable when he heard the commotion on the main street. He stepped out to see what the fuss was about, and found half the town gathered to watch the spectacle. The wagons were unlike anything Santa Rosa had seen before. Painted in red and gold, with elaborate lettering on the sides, they announced themselves as Sterling's Grand Traveling Circus. The lead wagon was pulled by 4 matched horses with braided manes and polished harnesses. Behind it came 2 more wagons, equally impressive, carrying what appeared to be props, equipment, and living quarters. At the reins of the lead wagon sat a man who could only be Maxwell Sterling himself. He was perhaps 55 years old, with silver hair, a carefully trimmed mustache, and the bearing of someone who'd spent his life commanding attention. He wore a burgundy coat with brass buttons and a black hat with a silk band. Everything about him spoke of showmanship and confidence. The circus set up camp in the field beyond the church, and by evening they'd erected a large tent striped in red and white. Handbills appeared all over town, announcing performances for the next 3 nights. The entrance fee was 25 cents, steep for Santa Rosa, but people were excited enough that Silas suspected Sterling would do good business. He attended the first performance that Thursday night, curious to see what a real circus looked like. He'd heard stories, of course, but he'd never actually seen one. The ticket price represented most of a day's wages for him, but he felt it was important to understand what professional performers did. The show was remarkable. There were acrobats who tumbled and flew through the air with impossible grace. A strong man who lifted weights that seemed beyond human capability. A woman in a spangled costume who performed tricks on horseback, standing upright as her mount cantered around the ring. Trained dogs that danced and jumped through hoops. Every act was polished, professional, designed to amaze. Silas watched it all with growing awareness of how amateur his own performances were by comparison. He and Penny put on a good show for a frontier saloon, but this was something else entirely. This was entertainment refined to an art form. What struck him most, though, was the way Maxwell Sterling worked the crowd. He served as the ringmaster, introducing each act with a booming voice and theatrical gestures. He knew exactly how to build excitement, when to let tension mount, when to release it with spectacle. He was a master showman, and watching him taught Silas more about performance in one evening than months of trial and error. After the show, as the crowd dispersed, Silas lingered near the tent. He told himself he was just interested in the circus mechanics, how they managed the logistics. But truthfully, he was hoping for a chance to speak with Sterling. The ringmaster emerged from the tent, still in his performance clothes, speaking with some of his performers. Silas recognized the woman equestrienne, whose name the program had listed as Clara. She was laughing at something Sterling said, and the easy camaraderie between them spoke of long association. Sterling noticed Silas watching and, to his surprise, walked over with a friendly smile. "You enjoyed the show?" Sterling asked. "Very much, sir. It was. I've never seen anything like it. That's what we aim for. Spectacle and wonder." Sterling studied him with sharp, intelligent eyes. "You're Silas Boone, aren't you?" "The fellow with the performing horse." Silas blinked in surprise. "How did you know that?" "I make it my business to know about performing acts in any town we visit. I heard about you and your little horse from the saloon keeper. He speaks very highly of your show. It's nothing compared to what I just saw, perhaps. But then again, everyone has to start somewhere." Sterling pulled out a silver cigarette case and offered one to Silas, who declined. "I'd like to see this horse of yours perform, if that could be arranged. You want to come to Dutch Henry's saloon?" "No, I'd prefer something more private. An audition, if you will. Tomorrow morning at our camp. Bring your horse and show me what she can do. If I like what I see, we might have something to discuss." Silas barely slept that night. An audition with a real circus. The possibility of what exactly? He didn't dare put it into words, afraid of jinxing whatever might happen. But the hope bloomed in his chest regardless, warm and insistent. He spent the morning grooming Penny until her coat gleamed. He put on his cleanest clothes and the red bandana costume piece they'd been using. When he led her to the circus camp, his hands were shaking slightly. Maxwell Sterling was waiting for them, along with several of his performers. The woman Clara was there, and the acrobat from the show, a lean man with dark hair that Sterling introduced as Giuseppe. There was also an older woman, wearing a colorful shawl, who was introduced as Martha, the circus fortune-teller. "So this is the famous Penny," Sterling said, studying the little horse with professional interest. "She's even smaller than I'd heard." "What is she, 28 inches?" "About 30, Silas said. "Maybe 32 on a good day." That got a laugh from the assembled performers. Sterling gestured to the center of the tent. "Show us what you've got, Mr. Boone." Silas led Penny into the ring, and for a moment his mind went blank. This was nothing like performing in Dutch Henry's saloon. These were professionals, people who knew real entertainment. What if Penny wasn't good enough? What if he wasn't good enough? Then Penny looked up at him with those intelligent eyes, and something settled inside him. They were partners. Whatever happened, they'd face it together. He started the routine, his voice gaining strength as he went. Penny performed beautifully, hitting every cue with precision. The counting trick brought smiles. The yes and no routine drew appreciative nods. And when Penny played dead, collapsing with perfect dramatic timing, Martha actually applauded. When it was over, Silas stood there, breathing hard, waiting for judgment. The performers exchanged glances he couldn't read. Finally, Maxwell Sterling stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "Mr. Boone, that was quite impressive. Your horse is remarkably well trained, and the bond between you is obvious. I can see why you've been successful. Thank you, sir. I'd like to make you an offer." Sterling paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Join us. Bring your act into Sterling's grand traveling circus. We tour throughout the territories, Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, sometimes up into Montana. We perform in mining towns, railroad camps, anywhere there's people wanting entertainment. You'd be part of the show, a regular act. We'd provide transportation, food, a place to sleep, and a percentage of the gate receipts, of course." Silas felt dizzy. "You're serious?" "Completely. You've got something special here. With proper staging and promotion, Penny could be a featured attraction. People love novelty and a performing miniature horse. Well, that's about as novel as it gets." Sterling smiled. "What do you say, Mr. Boone? Ready to see more of the world than Santa Rosa, New Mexico?" The question hung there, enormous and life-changing. Leave Santa Rosa. Leave the only stability he'd known in years. Take Penny on the road with a traveling circus, performing for strangers in towns he'd never seen. Can I have some time to think about it?" Of course. We leave Sunday morning. If you decide to join us, be here at dawn with whatever you want to bring. We travel light, so keep possessions to a minimum. Sterling offered his hand. I hope you'll say yes, Mr. Boone. I think we could do great things together. Walking back to Mrs. Carmichael's, Silas felt like his feet weren't quite touching the ground. A circus, a real traveling circus, wanted him and Penny. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, the kind of thing that didn't happen to men like him, but it was also terrifying. The unknown, the risk, the possibility of failure on a much larger stage than Dutch Henry's saloon. He spent the rest of the day in turmoil, weighing options and possibilities. That evening, he sought out Father Miguel at the church. Father Miguel listened to the whole story without interrupting, his weathered hands folded on the worn wooden pew. When Silas finished, the priest was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the simple cross at the front of the church. "What does your heart tell you?" he finally asked. "That I'm scared, that this could be a terrible mistake, that I might lose everything I've built here. And what else does it tell you?" Silas took a breath. "That I'll regret it forever if I don't try." Father Miguel smiled. "Then you already know your answer. Fear is natural, Silas, but regret is far worse. It's a poison that works slowly, eating away at a man until he's nothing but bitterness and what-ifs. What if I fail? What if I'm not good enough? Then you'll learn, you'll adapt, and you'll become good enough. That's what you've been doing your whole life. This is just the next step." The priest placed a hand on Silas's shoulder. "You asked me once what I thought about you buying that horse. I told you that sometimes what we need finds us in unexpected packages. Now opportunity has found you in the form of a traveling circus. Don't turn your back on it." Silas walked to Mrs. Carmichael's in the gathering dark, the priest's words echoing in his mind. When he reached the boarding house, he found Mrs. Carmichael sitting on the porch, rocking slowly in her chair. "You're thinking of going with them, aren't you?" She said. "It wasn't really a question. How did you know?" "I saw you talking to that circus man this morning." "I'm old, Silas, not blind." She stopped rocking and looked at him directly. "You should go. I'd be leaving you short a tenant. I'll find another tenant. Santa Rosa's small, but there's always someone passing through needing a room." She stood and walked to where he stood. "You've been just existing here, Silas, surviving but not really living. That little horse gave you purpose, but this town is too small for what you could become. Go see the world. Make something of yourself. I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done for me. You already have. You paid your rent, you worked hard, and you treated an old woman with respect. That's thanks enough." She patted his arm. "Now go pack your things and stop worrying so much. Life's too short for that." Saturday evening's performance at Dutch Henry's had a different energy. Silas hadn't announced he was leaving, but somehow word had spread anyway. The saloon was packed with people who'd come to say goodbye to a show that had become part of the town's fabric. When the performance ended and the applause finally died down, Dutch Henry called for quiet. "Most of you have heard by now that our friend Silas has been offered a position with Sterling's circus. Tomorrow he and Penny will be leaving Santa Rosa to tour with the show." There was a murmur through the crowd, surprise from those who hadn't heard, sadness from those who had. "Now I know some of you might be thinking it's a shame to see them go," Dutch Henry continued. "But I say we should be proud. Santa Rosa's own Silas Boone and his remarkable little horse are heading for bigger things. Let's give them a proper send-off." The applause that followed was different from the usual performance appreciation. This was genuine affection, respect, and good wishes. Silas felt his throat tighten with emotion. These people had seen him at his lowest and had witnessed his rise. Now they were cheering him on to something greater. Burton Graves was conspicuously absent from the crowd. Sunday morning came cold and grey, with clouds promising rain later. Silas packed his belongings, which didn't take long. His clothes fit in a single bag. His saddle, that precious connection to his past, he decided to take with him. It was impractical, maybe, but he couldn't leave it behind. The rest of his possessions he gave to Mrs. Carmichael to distribute to whoever might need them. Father Miguel was waiting at the circus camp when Silas arrived with Penny. So was Mrs. Carmichael. and Dutch Henry, and a handful of others who'd come to see them off, Maxwell Sterling greeted them all with the practiced warmth of a showman. "Welcome to Sterling's Grand Travelling Circus, Mr. Boone. You're officially part of the family now." The other performers introduced themselves properly. Clara, the equestrienne, was a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. Giuseppe, the acrobat, was Italian and spoke with an accent that added flavor to his words. Martha, the fortune-teller, gave Silas a knowing look that suggested she saw more than most people. "You'll ride in the third wagon," Sterling explained. "Martha and Giuseppe are in there too. Quarters are tight, but we make it work. Clara and I are in the lead wagon with the married couples. Single performers go in the back." There were goodbyes to say, and they were harder than Silas expected. Mrs. Carmichael pressed a package of food into his hands. Father Miguel blessed both Silas and Penny with simple words that carried weight. Dutch Henry shook his hand with genuine warmth. "You make us proud out there," the saloon keeper said. "Show them what Santa Rosa can produce." Then the wagons were moving, wheels creaking as the horses leaned into their harnesses. Silas sat in the back of the third wagon, Penny secure in a padded stall they'd prepared for her. He watched Santa Rosa recede into the distance, the little town growing smaller, until it was just a smudge on the horizon, and then nothing at all. "First time leaving home?" Martha asked. She was sitting across from him, her colorful shawls arranged around her like a nest. "First time having reason to leave," Silas replied. "There's a difference between running from something and running toward something," she said. "You're doing the latter. That's good. That's what all of us here are doing." Over the next days, Silas began to understand the rhythm of circus life. They traveled during the day, stopping in the late afternoon to set up camp. Everyone had jobs to do. The tent went up through practice teamwork, guy ropes staked, benches arranged. They'd perform that night, pack up the next morning, and move to the next town. It was hard work, harder than Silas had expected. But there was a camaraderie to it that he'd never experienced before. These people worked together, ate together, looked out for each other. They were a family by choice rather than blood, bound together by their shared love of performing. Giuseppe took Silas under his wing, teaching him the finer points of showmanship. "It's not enough to just do the tricks," the acrobat explained in his musical accent. "You must connect with the audience. Make them care about you and Penny. Tell them a story with your performance." Clara helped him refine Penny's costume, adding touches that made her look more professional. She also taught him how to enter and exit the ring with proper flair, how to acknowledge applause, how to pace a performance for maximum impact. Sterling himself offered advice on stage presence and timing. "You're good, Boone, but you can be better. Watch the audience. Learn to read their mood. Some crowds want excitement, others want sentiment. Give them what they need." The first official performance as part of the circus was in a mining town called Silver Creek. Silas was nervous, his stomach in knots as he waited for his turn in the ring. Giuseppe noticed and put a hand on his shoulder. "Breathe," the acrobat said. "Remember, they already want to love you. You just have to not get in the way." Then Sterling was announcing him, and now, direct from the frontier, a marvel of nature and training, the amazing Penny and her partner, Silas Boone. And Silas was walking into the ring with Penny beside him. The crowd was larger than anything he'd performed for before. Easily 300 people, maybe more. They watched with curious eyes as this man and his tiny horse took center stage. Silas started the routine, and almost immediately he felt the difference. The big tent, the professional setting, the anticipation of the crowd, it all elevated the performance. Penny seemed to sense it too. She performed with extra flair, holding her bows a beat longer, playing her counting routine for maximum comedy. When she played dead at the end, the applause was deafening. Silas stood there, stunned by the response, while Penny remained motionless on the ground. Only when he gave the cue did she spring back to life, bounding around the ring in a victory lap that brought the house down. Backstage, the other performers congratulated him warmly. Sterling was grinning. "Now that's what I'm talking about. You were born for this, Boone, born for it." That night, lying in his bedroll in the wagon, while Martha snored softly across from him and Giuseppe breathed the steady rhythm of deep sleep. Silas stared at the canvas ceiling and marveled at the turn his life had taken. 3 months ago, he'd been broke and desperate, buying a tiny horse for 50 cents out of something that might have been impulse or might have been fate. Now he was traveling with a circus, performing for crowds, part of something bigger than himself. In her stall, Penny shifted and made a soft sound. Silas reached over and touched her nose gently. "We did it," he whispered. "We actually did it." Tomorrow would bring another town, another performance, another step forward on this improbable journey. But tonight, Silas Boone allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in years. He felt proud. 3 months on the road transformed Silas in ways he couldn't have imagined. The constant travel, the regular performances, the daily interaction with professional entertainers, all of it shaped him into someone more confident, more capable. He learned to read crowds, to adjust his performance based on their energy. He expanded Penny's routine, adding new tricks and refining old ones. They became one of the most popular acts in the show. The circus moved through Arizona territory, then into Colorado. They performed in mining camps where men starved for entertainment, packed the tent, and cheered every trick. They set up in railroad towns where families came dressed in their Sunday best. Each performance was different, each crowd unique, but the response to Penny was always enthusiastic. Silas wrote letters to Father Miguel when he could, chronicling their journey. The priest wrote back with news from Santa Rosa, always encouraging, always proud. Mrs. Carmichael sent a brief note saying she'd rented his room to a schoolteacher and that the town still talked about him and Penny. Denver came in early autumn, a growing city that felt almost cosmopolitan after months of frontier camps. Sterling had arranged for them to perform at a proper theater rather than under canvas, a sign of how successful the tour had been. The venues were getting larger, the audiences more sophisticated. "This is where we prove we're not just a frontier novelty," Sterling told the troupe. "Denver has standards. We meet them. We can command better rates everywhere we go." The theater seated 500, and opening night it was full. Silas stood backstage, listening to the crowd's anticipatory murmur, and felt the familiar mix of nerves and excitement. Beside him, Penny waited calmly, as if she'd been performing in proper theaters her whole life. The show went flawlessly. Every act landed perfectly. When Silas and Penny took the stage, they delivered their best performance yet. The counting routine got laughs. The yes and no questions brought applause. And the playing dead finale had people on their feet cheering. They performed 6 shows over 3 nights, each one to capacity crowds. Newspaper critics attended and wrote glowing reviews. One called Penny a marvel of equine intelligence and training. Another declared Silas and Penny the most charming act to grace Denver's stages in years. It was during the final Denver performance that Silas noticed the well-dressed stranger. The man sat in the 3rd row, watching the show with intense focus. He wasn't smiling or clapping like the others. He was studying everything with the attention of someone taking mental notes. After the show, as Silas was leading Penny back to the wagons, Maxwell Sterling approached with the stranger in tow. "Boone, this is Mr. Edmund Hartwell," Sterling said. "He'd like to speak with you about Penny." Hartwell was perhaps 40, dressed in a fine suit that marked him as a man of means from back east. He had the bearing of someone used to being obeyed, but his expression was more curious than commanding. "Mr. Boone," Hartwell said, offering his hand. "That's a remarkable animal you have. May I ask where you acquired her?" "Bought her at a livestock auction in Santa Rosa, New Mexico, about 6 months ago. For how much, if you don't mind my asking?" 50 cents, Hartwell's eyebrows rose. 50 cents. That's quite remarkable, given what she's worth. Something in the man's tone made Silas uneasy. "What do you mean, what she's worth?" "Mr. Boone, may we speak privately? I have some information that I believe will be of great interest to you." They went to Sterling's wagon, where Martha and Clara joined them at Sterling's invitation. Whatever this was about, Sterling clearly felt it needed witnesses. Hartwell settled into a chair and opened a leather case he'd been carrying. He pulled out several documents and photographs. "Mr. Boone, your horse is not simply a small horse. She's a Falabella, a very rare breed of miniature horse from Argentina. They're the smallest breed in the world and extremely valuable. I run a breeding program in Philadelphia, one of only 3 in the United States." He laid out photographs showing horses that looked remarkably like Penny. Same proportions, same size, same delicate build. 2 years ago, I had 4 breeding mares stolen from my farm. It was a professional operation. The thieves knew exactly what they were taking and how to transport them. Hartwell pulled out another set of papers, breeding records, ownership documents. "This is Penelope's Pride, one of my stolen mares. And unless I'm very much mistaken, she's the horse standing in your wagon right now." Silas felt the floor tilt beneath him. "That's not possible. Penny's mine. I bought her legal and proper. I'm not suggesting you stole her, Mr. Boone, but I am saying she was stolen from me." Hartwell pulled out a detailed photograph pointing to specific markings. "Look at this pattern on her left shoulder. It's distinctive. And this slight irregularity in her right ear, that's from a foaling injury when she was young. Check your horse. I believe you'll find these same markings." With growing dread, Silas went to examine Penny. The markings were there, exactly as Hartwell had described. The pattern on the shoulder Silas had always thought was just an interesting coat variation. The tiny notch in the ear he'd assumed was from some minor accident. He came back to the wagon, his mouth dry. "She has those markings." "I thought so." Hartwell's expression was sympathetic but firm. "Mr. Boone, I don't want to cause you distress. From what I've seen, you've cared for her well and trained her remarkably. But legally, Penelope's Pride belongs to me. I have all the documentation to prove it." The words hit Silas like physical blows. Lose Penny? Lose his partner, his purpose, the creature that had saved his life as surely as he'd saved hers? It wasn't possible. He wouldn't allow it. "No," Silas heard himself say. "I bought her legal. I have witnesses. I paid for her fair and square, from thieves who had no right to sell her," Hartwell said gently. "The law is clear on this. Stolen property must be returned to its rightful owner, regardless of good faith purchases." Sterling had been quiet through all this, but now he spoke up. "Mr. Hartwell, surely there's room for negotiation here. Mr. Boone has built his entire life around this horse. They're partners. I understand that, and I'm not unsympathetic. But Penelope's Pride represents years of breeding work and significant investment. She's worth conservatively $5,000 as breeding stock." The number was staggering. $5,000. More money than Silas would make in a lifetime. It was proof, if he needed it, of just how far beyond his means Penny truly was. "I can't pay that," Silas said quietly. "I don't have anything close to that kind of money." "I know." Hartwell was silent for a moment. "I've spent 2 years tracking my stolen horses. I've found 3 of the 4. Penelope's Pride is the last one. I have buyers waiting, breeding contracts ready. From a purely business standpoint, I should take her back to Philadelphia and resume my program. But," Clara prompted, catching something in the man's tone, "but I saw your performance tonight, Mr. Boone. I saw the bond between you and that horse. And I saw something I didn't expect: joy. Pure, genuine joy. She loves performing. That's rare. Most performing animals are simply trained to tolerate it. She actually enjoys it." Hartwell pulled out another document, this one blank. "I'm prepared to make you an offer. You can't buy her outright. The price is beyond your reach. But I could sell you a partnership. You keep her, continue performing with her, care for her for the rest of her natural life. In return, I retain breeding rights. When she's past performing age, she comes back to my farm for breeding. Any foal she produces, I own. You continue to earn from her performances, and I eventually recover my investment through her offspring." "How much?" Sterling asked. $1,000 for a 50% partnership. That gives Mr. Boone legal ownership, ensures Penny stays with him, and gives me the breeding rights I need, $1,000. It was still an enormous sum, but it was possible. Barely. Silas had saved maybe $300 from his performances. Sterling might advance him the rest against future earnings, but before he could speak, Hartwell continued. "There's one more condition. I want documentation of her lineage, photographs of her performing, updates on her health and training. I'm not just protecting my investment. I'm genuinely curious about her development. A performing Falabella is unprecedented. It could open up entirely new possibilities for the breed. Silas looked at Penny, standing patiently in her stall. She was watching him with those intelligent eyes, unaware that her entire future hung in the balance. "If I agree to this," Silas said slowly, "I need it in writing that Penny stays with me for her whole performing life, that nobody can take her away or force me to stop performing with her, that she's mine until the day she's too old to work." Agreed. I'll have my attorney draw up a contract that makes that absolutely clear. You have my word, Mr. Boone. I'm not here to destroy what you've built. I'm here to find a way forward that respects both our interests. Sterling and Silas stepped outside to discuss it privately. The night air was cool, and somewhere in the distance a train whistle echoed through the city. "I can loan you 700, Sterling said, "against future earnings. It would take a while to pay back, but it's doable. I have 300 saved. That makes 1,000. Silas ran a hand through his hair. "Maxwell, am I crazy for even considering this? I barely understand what's happening. What's happening is that your 50-cent horse turned out to be worth $5,000. And a decent man is offering you a chance to keep her, when legally he could just take her and walk away." Sterling put a hand on Silas's shoulder. "This is a good deal, Silas. Take it." They returned to the wagon where Hartwell was waiting patiently. The man stood when they entered, reading the answer in Silas's face. "I accept your offer," Silas said. $1,000 for a partnership that lets me keep performing with Penny for as long as she's able. "Then we have a deal, Mr. Boone." Hartwell shook his hand firmly. "I'll have the contracts drawn up tomorrow. In the meantime, continue your tour. You've got something special with that little horse. Don't let this legal matter diminish what you've accomplished." After Hartwell left, Silas sat in the dark wagon for a long time, processing everything that had happened. He'd thought he was finally secure, finally building something that couldn't be taken away. Instead, he'd discovered that Penny had never really been his at all. She was worth a fortune, a breeding mare of incredible value, stolen property that by all rights should have been confiscated. But somehow, through a combination of Hartwell's decency and Sterling's support, he'd managed to hold on to her. It would cost him every penny he had and leave him in debt for years. But Penny would stay. They would continue performing together. He walked to her stall and pressed his forehead against hers. She made a soft sound, her breath warm against his face. "Penelope's pride," he said softly. "That's who you really are. Not just Penny. Someone special. Someone valuable." She nudged him gently, and Silas felt his eyes burn with emotion. He'd spent 50 cents on what he thought was a throwaway horse nobody wanted. Instead, he'd found a creature worth thousands of dollars. But the money didn't matter. The breeding rights didn't matter. What mattered was the partnership, the bond, the way they'd saved each other. "You're still my Penny," he told her. "Nothing changes that. Not contracts, not breeding programs, not money. You're mine and I'm yours. That's how it stays." In the morning, Edmund Hartwell returned with his attorney and the contracts. Silas signed them without hesitation, watching his $300 and Sterling's $700 loan transfer into Hartwell's hands. In return, he received a document that proclaimed him co-owner of Penelope's Pride, with full performing rights in perpetuity. "Take care of her," Hartwell said as he prepared to leave. "And send me updates. I want to know how her career progresses." "I will," Silas promised. As Hartwell's carriage pulled away, Clara came to stand beside Silas. "You know what this means, don't you?" "What?" "You're not just a man with a performing horse anymore. You're the owner of the most famous Falabella in America. Once word gets out what she really is, everyone's going to want to see her." Clara smiled. "Your life just got a lot more interesting, Silas Boone." She was right. The news spread quickly. Newspapers picked up the story of the stolen mare turned performing sensation, the broke cowboy who'd bought a fortune for 50 cents. Suddenly, Penny wasn't just a novelty act. She was a phenomenon, and Silas Boone, the man who'd been nobody just months before, was becoming something he'd never imagined. He was becoming famous. The story of Penny's true identity created publicity that money couldn't buy. Newspapers across the West picked it up, each adding their own embellishments. Some called her the Princess Horse. Others went with the 50-cent fortune. Harper's Weekly sent a reporter to interview Silas and write a feature story that would reach readers all across America. Maxwell Sterling was thrilled with the attention. "You can't pay for this kind of advertising," he said, waving a stack of newspaper clippings. "Every paper west of the Mississippi has mentioned our circus. We're booked solid through next spring." But success brought complications Silas hadn't anticipated. Everyone wanted to see Penny now, which meant bigger crowds, more pressure, higher expectations. Some people came hoping to see her fail, to prove that the newspapers had exaggerated her abilities. Others came with offers to buy her, despite the contracts that made such sales impossible. The most persistent buyer was Burton Graves. The rancher showed up in Denver 3 weeks after Hartwell's visit, accompanied by a lawyer. He claimed that the auction in Santa Rosa had been fraudulent, that Silas had never actually paid the 50 cents, that the whole transaction was void. He produced a document supposedly signed by the auctioneer, stating that Silas had walked away without payment. It was a lie, pure and simple. But it was a lie backed by money and legal representation. Graves was trying to steal Penny through the courts, using his wealth to rewrite history. "He can't do this," Silas told Sterling, his hands shaking with anger and fear. "I paid. There were witnesses." "Then we'll get those witnesses to testify," Sterling replied. "But Boone, I'll be honest with you. Graves has resources. This could get expensive. Expensive meant attorneys, which meant money Silas didn't have. He'd just spent everything he owned buying partnership with Hartwell. Now he faced another legal battle, one that could cost more than he could possibly raise. The stress of it sat on his shoulders like a physical weight. He had trouble sleeping, trouble eating. His performance suffered, not badly, but enough that Giuseppe and Clara noticed and pulled him aside to talk. "You cannot let this man defeat you before the battle even begins," Giuseppe said. "You must fight, yes, but you must also live. You must perform. That is who you are now." "He's right," Clara added. "Graves wants to rattle you, to make you so worried about the future that you ruin the present. Don't give him that satisfaction. They were right, but knowing it didn't make the anxiety go away. Every day brought new legal papers, new motions, new attempts by Graves to establish that the auction had been invalid. The court date was set for 2 weeks away in Denver, which meant they couldn't leave the city. Sterling had to cancel performances in 2 other towns, losing money with each cancellation. "I'm sorry," Silas told him one evening. "This is all my fault. If I hadn't bought Penny—" "Stop right there," Sterling interrupted. "Penny is the best thing that's happened to this circus in 10 years. Whatever legal nonsense Graves is trying to pull, we'll deal with it. But don't you dare apologize for bringing that horse into our lives." The support from the circus family was unwavering. They rallied around Silas, offering what money they could spare for legal fees, providing emotional support, helping him prepare for testimony. Martha spent hours with him, coaching him on how to remain calm under questioning. Clara helped him gather documentation of everything related to the auction and purchase. Most importantly, Dutch Henry made the journey from Santa Rosa to Denver, bringing Mrs. Carmichael and Father Miguel with him. They were prepared to testify to the truth of what had happened that day at the auction. "You think we'd let that blowhard Burton Graves lie about you?" Dutch Henry said when they arrived. "Half of Santa Rosa wants to come testify, but the judge said 3 witnesses was enough. So here we are, seeing familiar faces from home, people who'd known him at his lowest and still thought enough of him to travel hundreds of miles to help." It broke something loose in Silas's chest. He'd spent so much of his life alone, assuming nobody cared what happened to him. Now he had a family, spread between Santa Rosa and the circus, all of them standing with him. The court hearing took place on a Tuesday morning in a Denver courtroom that smelled of wood polish and old law books. Burton Graves sat at the plaintiff's table with his lawyer, looking confident and prosperous. Silas sat with Sterling and the attorney Sterling had hired, feeling like he was fighting above his weight. The judge was a man in his 60s named Harrison, with tired eyes and a no-nonsense manner that suggested he'd seen every kind of legal trick imaginable. Graves's lawyer went first, presenting the fraudulent document from the auctioneer and building a case that Silas had essentially stolen Penny by claiming to pay but never following through. The auctioneer himself wasn't present. Conveniently, he'd moved to California and couldn't be reached. But his statement, whether forged or bought, seemed official enough. Then it was time for Silas's defense. Dutch Henry took the stand first, describing the auction in detail. He'd been there, had seen the whole thing. He testified that Silas had definitely paid, had counted out 2 quarters in front of everyone. "I remember it clear as day," Dutch Henry said, "because after he paid, Burton Graves made a big show of laughing about it. Called it Boone's thoroughbred. Made fun of him for wasting his last money on that little horse. Graves's lawyer tried to poke holes in the testimony, but Dutch Henry was unshakable. He'd been running a saloon for 15 years. He knew how to handle aggressive questioning. Mrs. Carmichael testified next, describing how Silas had returned to her boarding house with Penny, how he'd been broke afterward because he'd spent his last coins on the horse. "A man doesn't go hungry for days after an auction unless he actually spent his money there," she said pointedly. Father Miguel's testimony carried particular weight. As a priest, his word had moral authority. He described Silas's character, his honesty, his integrity. This is not a man who would claim to pay for something and then walk away without doing so. That's not who Silas Boone is. Finally, Silas himself took the stand. Graves's lawyer attacked immediately, trying to trip him up, to make him contradict earlier testimony, to cast doubt on his memory. But Silas stayed calm, remembering Martha's coaching. He told the truth simply and directly, never embellishing, never getting defensive. "I wanted a horse," he said. "I'd been a cowboy before my injury, and I missed working with animals. When Penny came up for auction, everybody laughed. Nobody wanted her. But I looked at her and saw something special. So I bid my last 50 cents. The auctioneer accepted. I paid. I took her home. That's the truth, whether Mr. Graves's paper says otherwise or not. And yet you claim this horse is now worth thousands of dollars," the lawyer said. "Convenient, isn't it? That a 50-cent purchase turned into a fortune. I didn't know what she was worth when I bought her. I just knew she needed someone to care about her. Turns out we needed each other. There's no crime in that." The judge called a recess to review the evidence. The wait was agonizing. Silas sat outside the courtroom with his supporters, trying not to imagine losing Penny, trying not to think about what it would mean if Graves won. Giuseppe sat beside him, quiet and solid. "Whatever happens in there, you have fought with honor. That matters, does it? If I lose Penny, what does honor matter? It matters because it is who you are. Win or lose, you remain Silas Boone. That cannot be taken from you." After what felt like hours, but was probably only 45 minutes, they were called back into the courtroom. Judge Harrison looked at Graves, then at Silas, his expression unreadable. "I've reviewed the testimony and evidence," he said. "Mr. Graves, your auctioneer's statement raises questions, but those questions are outweighed by the testimony of 3 credible witnesses who were actually present. Mrs. Carmichael and Mr. Henry have no apparent reason to lie, and Father Miguel's testimony carries significant weight. Moreover, Mr. Boone's subsequent actions, caring for the horse despite personal hardship, are consistent with someone who made a legitimate purchase." Graves leaned forward, his expression darkening. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I find it suspicious that you're only challenging this transaction now, 6 months after the fact, and only after the horse in question has become valuable and famous. If there was truly fraud at the auction, you should have raised the issue immediately. Your delay suggests opportunism rather than genuine grievance." "Your Honor," Graves's lawyer began, but the judge held up a hand. "I'm ruling in favor of the defendant. The transaction stands as legitimate. Mr. Boone's ownership of the horse known as Penny, or Penelope's Pride, is confirmed. This case is dismissed." He brought down his gavel with a sharp crack. Silas felt his legs go weak with relief. He'd won. Penny was safe. Graves couldn't touch her. The rancher stormed out of the courtroom without a word, his lawyer hurrying after him. Silas turned to find himself surrounded by supporters. Sterling. The circus performers, his friends from Santa Rosa, all of them congratulating him, clapping his back, expressing their joy. Outside the courthouse, Father Miguel pulled him aside. "You know what this means, Silas? It means you've truly made something of yourself. The man who was broken alone in Santa Rosa is now standing up to wealthy ranchers in Denver courts and winning. That's no small thing. I couldn't have done it without all of you. That's the point, son. None of us can do life alone. We need each other. You've built yourself a family across towns and circumstances. That's worth more than any horse, valuable as she is." That evening, Sterling announced that they'd be leaving Denver within the week. They were heading to San Francisco, where he'd booked them into one of the finest theaters on the West Coast. It would be the biggest venue they'd ever played, the most sophisticated audience. "This is where we prove we're not just a Western phenomenon," Sterling said to the assembled troupe. "San Francisco will make or break us. We need to be perfect." Silas spent the next days in intensive rehearsal with Penny. Giuseppe worked with him on new choreography, adding elements that would play well in a formal theater. Clara helped design a proper costume for Penny, something elegant enough for the city crowd. Martha advised on presentation and stagecraft. "You must remember," Giuseppe said, "San Francisco is not a mining camp. These people have seen real theater, real performances. They will judge you by higher standards." "That's encouraging," Silas muttered. No, is good. You rise to meet the challenge. This is how we grow, yes?" The pressure was immense, but it was also exciting. After months of performing in frontier towns and temporary venues, they were finally getting a chance to prove themselves on a major stage. This was what Silas had been working toward without even realizing it. The validation that he and Penny weren't just a novelty act, but legitimate performers. The journey to San Francisco took 2 weeks. They traveled through Nevada, across the Sierra Nevada mountains, and finally down into California. The landscape changed dramatically as they moved west, from desert to mountains to the rolling hills of the California coast. Sterling kept them informed of the arrangements. They'd be performing at the Golden Gate Theater, a venue that regularly hosted touring companies from New York and Europe. They'd have a week of shows, with the potential to extend if ticket sales were strong. The newspapers were already running advanced stories, building anticipation. "No pressure," Clara said with a wry smile. "Just the biggest opportunity of our lives." The night before they reached San Francisco, Silas couldn't sleep. He lay in his bedroll, listening to the breathing of his wagon mates, and thought about how far he'd come. A year ago, he'd been cleaning stables for 50 cents a day, 3 weeks behind on rent, with no prospects and no hope. Now he was traveling to San Francisco to perform in a major theater. He had a family in the circus troupe. He had money in his pocket and food in his belly. He had purpose and pride and a future that looked like something, all because of a tiny horse that cost him 50 cents. He got up and went to check on Penny. She was awake, her eyes bright in the darkness. Silas sat beside her stall and stroked her nose gently. "Tomorrow we reach San Francisco," he told her. "Everything we've worked for comes down to next week's performances. You ready for this?" She leaned her head against his hand, and Silas felt a wave of affection so strong it almost hurt. They'd been through so much together: poverty, mockery, legal battles, constant travel. Through it all, she'd been steady and true, performing with joy and grace, no matter the circumstances. "Whatever happens," he said softly, "I want you to know something. You saved my life, Penny. I was drowning when I met you, going under for the last time. You gave me a reason to keep breathing. I'll never forget that." She made a soft sound, almost like understanding, and Silas allowed himself to believe that she did understand, that she knew what she meant to him, that this partnership was as important to her as it was to him. The circus reached San Francisco on a clear October morning. The city spreading out before them with its hills and buildings and the glittering bay beyond. It was bigger than anywhere they'd performed, more impressive, more overwhelming. This was it. The moment that would define whether Silas Boone and his tiny horse were the real thing, or just a flash-in-the-pan novelty from the frontier. Only one way to find out. The Golden Gate Theatre was everything Silas had imagined and more. Gas lamps lined the walls, casting warm light over velvet seats arranged in curved rows that rose up toward an ornate ceiling painted with clouds and cherubs. The stage was massive, equipped with proper curtains and footlights that could be adjusted for different effects. It was built for grand opera and serious drama, and Silas felt small, standing on it during their afternoon rehearsal. "Remember what I taught you," Giuseppe said from the wings. "You own this space. The stage is yours when you are on it. Believe that, and the audience will believe it too." Opening night arrived with terrifying speed. Silas stood backstage in his best clothes. Clara had taken him shopping, insisting he needed something better than his worn cowboy shirt for a San Francisco audience. He wore a new vest, dark trousers, and a shirt with an actual collar. Penny had her own costume now, a blanket of deep blue velvet trimmed with gold braid, and a matching bridle with tiny bells that chimed softly when she moved. The theater was filling up. Through the curtain, Silas could hear the murmur of conversation, the rustling of programs, the occasional laugh. These were city people, sophisticated folks who attended theater regularly. They'd come to see if the frontier phenomenon lived up to the newspaper stories. Sterling gathered the troupe for a final word before the show. "Tonight isn't just about entertaining," he said. "It's about proving we belong on stages like this. We're not frontier curiosities. We're professional performers. Let's show San Francisco what that means." The show began with the acrobatic troupe, Giuseppe and his partners executing flawless tumbling runs that drew gasps and applause. Then the strongman, then Clara's equestrian routine. Each act was polished, professional, designed to build anticipation for what came next. Then Sterling was walking to center stage, his voice filling the theater. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my very great pleasure to introduce an act that has captured imaginations from the frontier to the finest venues in the West. You've read about them in your newspapers. You've heard the remarkable story of how they found each other. Now I invite you to witness the bond between man and horse that has made them the talk of the territories. Please welcome Mr. Silas Boone and the amazing Penny." The curtains parted, and Silas walked onto the stage with Penny beside him. For a moment the audience was silent, taking in the sight of the tiny horse. Then the applause began, polite but reserved. They were waiting to be impressed. Silas took a breath and began. "Thank you all for coming tonight. What you're about to see isn't just tricks or training. It's a partnership. 6 months ago, I bought this little horse for 50 cents at an auction where nobody wanted her. Turned out she was worth quite a bit more than that. But the real value wasn't in dollars. It was in what we found together." He'd never opened with a speech before, but something about the formal setting seemed to call for it. The audience was listening, genuinely interested. Her name is Penny, though her registered name is Penelope's Pride. She's a Falabella miniature horse, one of the rarest breeds in the world. But more than that, she's smart, talented, and she loves to perform. Let me show you what I mean. He ran through the routine, starting with the simple commands. "Penny, bow for the nice people." She bowed deeply, her nose nearly touching the stage, and the audience responded with warm applause. "Now, Penny and I have been working together long enough that we can communicate pretty well. Let me demonstrate. Penny, if you're happy to be here in San Francisco, nod your head yes." She nodded enthusiastically, and laughter rippled through the crowd. "And if you'd rather be anywhere else, shake your head no." She stood perfectly still, refusing to shake her head, and the laughter grew louder. They were warming up, starting to engage. Silas moved into the counting routine, asking Penny to solve simple arithmetic by pawing the ground. The audience delighted in it, calling out their own math problems for him to pose. When Penny consistently got the answers right, responding to Silas's subtle cues, people started to truly believe in her intelligence. Then came the color recognition. Silas held up squares of fabric in different colors, and Penny would pour once for red, twice for blue, 3 times for yellow. It was a new trick they'd been perfecting, and it landed perfectly. The sophistication of the audience didn't matter. They were enchanted. For the finale, Silas set up the playing dead routine carefully. "Now I need to warn you," he said with perfect timing. "What you're about to see might be disturbing. I'm going to demonstrate what happens when a horse hears the word taxes." The adult humor hit exactly right. The audience laughed in anticipation. "Penny, what do you think about taxes?" She collapsed to the stage as if shot, rolling onto her side with her legs in the air and her tongue hanging out dramatically. The effect was so sudden, so complete, so perfectly timed that the audience erupted in laughter and applause. Silas let it build for a moment, then called out, "Penny, I have sugar cubes." She sprang to life instantly, bounding up and prancing in a circle around him, while the audience roared its approval. They were on their feet now, the applause thunderous, genuine delight on their faces. Backstage, the circus family surrounded Silas with congratulations and embraces. Giuseppe lifted him off his feet in an exuberant hug. Clara was wiping tears from her eyes. Even Martha, usually so reserved, was smiling broadly. "That was magnificent," Sterling said, his voice thick with emotion. "That was everything I hoped for and more. You didn't just perform, Boone. You connected. You made them care." The reviews in the morning papers confirmed it. The San Francisco Chronicle called Silas and Penny the most charming act to grace our stage in memory. The Examiner declared them a triumph of training, trust, and genuine artistry. Every review was glowing, every critic enchanted. The next 6 performances were all sold out, with people standing in the aisles to catch a glimpse of the famous tiny horse. Sterling extended their run by another week, and those shows sold out within hours of the announcement. San Francisco couldn't get enough of Penny. On the 8th night after the show, Maxwell Sterling called a special meeting of the troupe. They gathered in the theater's green room, everyone curious about what was important enough to warrant such formality. Sterling stood before them, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "I've been running this circus for 23 years, he began. "Started with nothing but a borrowed tent and a dog that could jump through hoops. Built it into something I'm proud of. But I'm not getting any younger, and the road gets harder every year." He paused, looking at each of them. "I've received an offer from a gentleman in Chicago. He wants to buy the circus, equipment and contracts and all. It's a good offer. More than fair. I've been thinking about accepting it." A murmur went through the group. Clara looked stricken. Giuseppe's expression was carefully neutral, but Silas could see the concern in his eyes. "But," Sterling continued, holding up a hand, "I realized I don't want to sell to a stranger. I want to keep this family together. So I'm making a different proposal." He looked directly at Silas. "Boone, I want you to become my partner. Equal shares, equal say in how we run things. Together, we can take this circus to places I never could alone. Your name recognition, your draw with audiences, it opens doors. My experience and connections give us stability. Together, we could build something really special." Silas felt like the floor had dropped away beneath him. "Maxwell, I don't know anything about running a circus. You know about performing. You know about connecting with audiences. You know about loyalty and hard work. The business side we can learn together. Or hire someone to handle it." Sterling smiled. "What do you say? Want to go from 50 cents to circus owner?" The troupe was watching him, and Silas saw hope in their faces. They didn't want Sterling to sell to a stranger who might break up the family they'd built. They wanted to stay together. "I'd need to think about it," Silas said. It's a lot. Take your time. But not too much time. The Chicago offer stands for another month." That night, Silas sat in his dressing room with Penny, trying to process what had just happened. 6 months ago he'd been broke and desperate. Now he was being offered partnership in a successful circus. The trajectory of his life had changed so dramatically it was hard to believe it was real. Edmund Hartwell had been attending the San Francisco shows, and he knocked on the dressing room door that evening. "May I come in?" "Of course." Hartwell settled into a chair, looking at Penny with the fond expression of someone watching a valuable investment exceed all expectations. "I've been documenting her performances," he said, "taking notes, making sketches. What you've accomplished with her is remarkable, Boone. I've worked with Falabellas for years, but I've never seen one with her level of training and stage presence. She was like this when I found her. Someone trained her well before she was stolen. Yes, but someone else has maintained that training and expanded on it brilliantly. That someone is you." Hartwell pulled out an envelope. "I wanted to give you this. It's a revised contract. I'm reducing your partnership payment by half and extending the terms. You've more than proven that Penny's in good hands. This new agreement gives you more flexibility and better terms. Why would you do that? Because I've realized something. The breeding value is important, yes, but what you're doing with her is creating something more valuable, a legacy. She's not just a rare horse. She's proof of what's possible between human and animal. That matters more than I initially understood." After Hartwell left, Silas sat with the new contract, thinking about legacies and partnerships and the strange turns life could take. A year ago, he'd have signed anything just to survive another week. Now he was considering business deals and partnerships, making decisions that would affect dozens of people. Giuseppe found him there an hour later. "You're thinking too much, yes?" "Maybe, probably. Let me tell you something my father told me when I was young. He said, 'Giuseppe, life gives you moments where everything can change. You must have courage to take those moments, even when you are afraid. This is that moment for you, Silas. Maxwell would not offer partnership if he did not believe in you. But what if I fail? What if I'm not good enough? Then you fail trying something important, instead of succeeding at staying small and safe." Giuseppe smiled. "Besides, you have us. We help you. This is what family does." The next morning, Silas found Sterling in his office at the theater. The circus owner looked up from his paperwork, eyebrows raised in question. "I accept," Silas said. "Your partnership offer." "I accept." Sterling stood and offered his hand, a broad smile crossing his face. "Welcome to the circus business, partner. Now let's show the world what we can do." 6 months later, Sterling's grand traveling circus returned to New Mexico territory for the first time since Silas had joined. They were different now, expanded and improved. The partnership had brought new energy, new acts, better equipment. They traveled in 5 wagons instead of 3, and their tent was twice the size. Success had allowed them to grow, and grow they had. The telegram Silas sent to Santa Rosa was simple: coming home for 3 days. "Tell everyone." Silas. When the circus wagons rolled into town, it seemed like the entire territory had turned out to greet them. The main street was packed with people, and someone had hung a banner across the road. "Welcome home, Silas and Penny." Mrs. Carmichael was at the front of the crowd, looking older but no less sharp. Dutch Henry stood beside her, grinning broadly. And there was Father Miguel, wearing his Sunday vestments, even though it was a Tuesday. But what struck Silas most was that Burton Graves was nowhere to be seen. Dutch Henry explained later that Graves had fallen on hard times. Some bad investments, some debts coming due. He'd sold most of his land and moved to Texas with his family. The man who'd mocked Silas for buying a 50-cent horse was gone, while Silas had returned a success. They set up the tent in the same field where Sterling's circus had first arrived all those months ago. The circle was complete. Silas stood in the empty ring before the first show, remembering the scared, broke man he'd been. That person felt like a stranger now, thinking deep thoughts. Clara asked, walking up beside him, just remembering. "This is where it all started, really. Where I saw what real performing looked like. And now you're one of the real performers. Funny how life works." The Santa Rosa shows were special. Silas invited everyone in town to attend free of charge, his gift to the community that had supported him when he had nothing. The tent was packed all 3 nights, with familiar faces beaming up at him from every row. He told the story during each performance, the whole story from beginning to end. How he'd bought Penny for 50 cents because something in her eyes spoke to him. How she'd turned out to be worth thousands, but the real value was in their partnership. How one decision made when he was at his lowest had led to everything good that followed. "I learned something important from this little horse," he said on the final night, with his Santa Rosa family watching. "I learned that value isn't always obvious, that sometimes what looks like nothing is actually everything, and that taking a chance on something small and seemingly insignificant can change your whole life." After the show, there was a gathering at Dutch Henry's saloon. Everyone was there, performers and townspeople mixing together. Sharing stories and laughter, Mrs. Carmichael presented Silas with a gift, his old leather saddle, which she'd kept safe for him. "I know you've got your own wagon now and don't need it," she said, "but I thought you might want it anyway." As a reminder, Silas ran his hands over the familiar leather, feeling emotion well up in his chest. "Thank you. For this, and for everything else. You gave me a place to stay when I had nowhere to go. You believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. I just gave you a room, Silas. You did the rest." Father Miguel pulled him aside later in the evening. "I've been saving your letters," the priest said. "Everyone you've sent. I thought someday you might want to remember this journey, all the steps along the way. I don't think I could forget it if I tried. Maybe not. But memories fade. Words on paper stay true." Father Miguel smiled. "I'm proud of you, son. Not because you're successful, but because you stayed true to yourself through it all. Success can change a man, usually for the worse. But you're still Silas Boone, just with better clothes and more confidence." On the final morning, as the circus prepared to leave Santa Rosa, Silas took Penny for a walk through town. They passed the general store, where he used to muck stables, the boarding house where he'd lived in that tiny room, the church where Father Miguel had counseled him through hard times. He stopped at the old corral where the auction had taken place. The fence was weathered now, some of the posts leaning, but he could still picture it clearly. The crowd, the laughter, the moment he'd raised his hand to bid 50 cents on a horse nobody wanted. "That's where it all began," he told Penny. "Right there. That's where you saved my life." She looked at the corral, then back at him, and bobbed her head as if she remembered too. The circus left Santa Rosa to cheers and waves, heading northeast toward Colorado. They had shows booked through the next year, with offers coming in from as far away as St. Louis and Chicago. Sterling's Grand Traveling Circus was becoming a household name across the West, and much of that success came from the tiny horse who could count and bow and play dead on command. But for Silas, the success wasn't measured in ticket sales or newspaper reviews. It was measured in belonging, in purpose, in having a family that chose each other. It was measured in letters from Father Miguel and care packages from Mrs. Carmichael. It was measured in Giuseppe's friendship and Clara's wisdom and Martha's quiet support. Most of all, it was measured in his partnership with Penny, the creature who'd seen something in him that he hadn't seen in himself. In his private space in the wagon, Silas kept 3 things on a shelf. His old leather saddle, small enough now that it seemed to belong to a different life. The letters from Father Miguel, tied together with string, and mounted in a simple wooden frame. A single 50-cent piece, not the one he'd spent on Penny, but another he'd bought to commemorate that day. Sometimes, late at night, when the circus was quiet and everyone else was asleep, Silas would look at that coin and marvel at the journey it represented. 50 cents. The difference between despair and hope, between ending and beginning, between who he'd been and who he'd become. He'd spent years thinking his life was over, that his best days were behind him. And Tiny Horse had proven him wrong. She'd shown him that sometimes the smallest investments yield the greatest returns, that faith the size of 50 cents could move mountains. The circus traveled on through the territories, bringing joy and wonder to frontier towns and growing cities alike. Everywhere they went, people lined up to see the famous Penny, the miniature horse who changed one man's life and captured a nation's heart. But Silas knew the real story wasn't about a horse worth thousands being bought for 50 cents. It was about 2 creatures, one human, one horse, who'd found each other when they both needed saving, who'd built something beautiful from nothing, who'd proven that value isn't determined by size or circumstance, but by love and loyalty and the courage to take a chance. Sometimes the best things in life really do come in the smallest packages. And sometimes, when you've got nothing left but faith and 50 cents, that's exactly enough to change everything. The circus rolled on toward tomorrow, toward the next town, the next show, the next opportunity to bring light and laughter to people who needed it. And at the heart of it all was a tiny horse and the cowboy who'd believed in her, traveling together toward a future neither could have imagined. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.